Hello everyone, I hope you are all doing well. Okay, microphone on, microphone off. Hello once again everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to your applied mechanics. For today we will be covering a little bit of our friction or frictional resistance module. If you have questions at any point, you know what to do, so let's get straight into it. So for starters, we will check what we are actually talking about when we mention friction. Okay, I feel like it's important for us to go through a little bit of this theory so that we understand what we are dealing with. So on here we will be discussing essentially what happens when you are pulling a body or a mass across either a plane or a floor. It could be completely flat or it could even be on an incline. All right, so essentially we're trying to understand if you are here pulling this across, right? Or if you are on this incline trying to somehow pull that, what happens and what is it that causes this thing either not to move, i.e. remain stagnant or to remain stationary, or what is this force that essentially works against your pulling force? So that's what the module, or that's what we will essentially be discussing today. So if you are pulling something in this direction, let's say you are pulling it with a force of about 10 newtons, let's say, for argument's sake, right? But the floor exerts a force in the opposite direction of, let's say, 20 newtons. What this means is essentially you have 10 there, then you have 20 there, then as a result, it means this will in fact be set back 10. Okay? That's just to get into the basics of what it is that we will be discussing or talking about. But let me not confuse you with that for now. For starters, let's get into some laws, what we mean by friction, and how we'll be going about calculating it in this specific module. So friction is simply put when one solid rough surface slides over another solid rough surface. The degree of roughness will of course depend on what you are dealing with, but for purposes of this we're essentially looking at when an object slides over another object or slides over another surface. So we have a couple of laws that will govern it. For starters, the very first law, we'll say A, says frictional resistance is dependent on the materials and the degree of smoothness of the concerned surfaces. So for instance, if you are pulling a box across the floor and this is maybe your ceramic tiled floor, right? The way this will slide over that compared to if you were to pull the same box of the same mass over, I'd say, a tar road, how it moves across those surfaces won't be the same, and this will of course be affected by the degree of smoothness of the surface concerned, right? That's law number 1, or law A. Law B says that your frictional resistance against motion will be proportional to the vertical force between the body and the surface over which it slides. All right, so we have the surface, we have the body. The body is trying to move in the set direction. Your frictional resistance, the resistance for this body to move, will essentially be determined by the force that will happen between the body and the surface. There will be a force that is being exerted between the body and the surface, and that is essentially what will help you determine your resistance for this body to flow. Okay, that is law B, or law number 2. Then law C essentially gets into the sizing. Your friction is independent of the size of the areas which are in contact with each other. So whether you are pulling a small ball of this size or whether you're pulling a big rock of this size, essentially your frictional resistance or your friction will not depend on the size of the thing you're pulling. And number D feeds into that a little bit. It says that friction will be independent of the speed. So how slow, how quick you pull it essentially will not determine your friction or frictional resistance. Okay, so the size of the thing as well will be negligible for now. Then I want us to get into the formula. We'll just call this E, and essentially this says your frictional resistance. I'll just try to write it out in full first. Frictional my pen decides to stop. Why are you stopping? Okay, it decided to give me a different color. Frictional resistance. And that will be your F mu. Okay. I know everything is a bit skewed, but bear with me. Your frictional resistance will be equal to the perpendicular forces, okay, that are acting. Remember, there will be that force that is acting between the body and the surface, times your coefficient of friction. Okay, so what this formula looks like essentially is your F. I think it's a mu. I call it a mu. I don't know what it's called. Your forces, that looks wrong, multiplied by that coefficient. Okay, so this is a formula that we will be using, and that will govern us quite a lot, especially when moving into how we'll be going about our business. Okay, right, so just to represent this in terms of a diagram, as I know there's some people who prefer diagrams in order to get a concept, right? So we said we have a surface. It's the ground, right? Then there's a body here. There's an object, a thing that you'll be moving, and it'll have a mass in kg, right? That's our flat surface on there. And this is being pulled with a force F. For now, we'll just say F, because we don't really know of the figures. We don't really know how big, how small that is, right? But if you'll be pulling your body with a force F, there will be, in most cases, an equal but opposite frictional resistance, F mu, that is pushing in the opposite direction. So if I'm trying to, let's say I'm trying to pull a box, right? And this box is heavy, and this box is simply not sliding across the floor. Let's say that's me there trying to pull it. We'll just say my hands extend to them, trying to pull it. If this box remains in the same place, it means the force that I am exerting to try and pull the box and the frictional resistance that is being provided by the box are equal. Okay? That is simply what it means, right? So there will be the force I'm exerting on it. There's a frictional resistance that the box is kind of exerting on me, but it's exerting it on the surface. And then there is the force that will essentially be between the body and the ground, and it will essentially be your force in Newton. Could be that the weight of the body times your gravitational, it gives you your force. All right, I hope this is not confusing, but if it is, let me know. I'll be more than happy to clarify it. Okay, so what we're saying is if your force is equal to your frictional resistance, then your body stays the same. Your body will stay stationary or will stay the same. Okay, so your body will remain in one single place. Okay, so this is essentially what we'll refer to as your forces being in equilibrium. This is what we will call our limit of static friction. All right, that is essentially what we call. Okay, So just to recap on this before we get into some examples, right? Your frictional resistance, okay? Your frictional resistance is always acting against the expected direction of motion. So that's the first one you need to remember. Your frictional resistance is always parallel to the surface on which your motion takes place, right? That's pointer number 2 to remember. Pointer number 3, your frictional resistance will be calculated from your perpendicular forces as well as your coefficient of friction, okay? Then, where are we? 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 4, your frictional resistance will always be smaller than the force between the body and the surface. Okay? The force that is necessary to move your body over the horizontal surface will always be smaller than essentially the weight of that body. Okay? You won't need a force as big as the weight of that body to essentially move it. Okay? So now we can get into some I'd say graphical examples so that we can try and understand what we mean on here. All right. So these points that I've raised, they are normally applicable if it is a flat surface and if it's on an incline as well. Okay. So I'll show you a diagram on here, and we will from time to time refer to this diagram, so don't forget it today. Okay. Or try not to forget about it today. Then we have our A, we have our B there, C, D. Alright, then on here is a 90 degree. On here we have theta. On here we have alpha. And then inside here we have our beta. Then on there is a 90-degree angle as well. It might not look like a 90-degree angle, but you believe me, it's a 90-degree angle. So by now you would have already gone through your method of components, and you already kind of know how to go about expressing your inclined line as either your either your perpendicular or your parallel components, right? So on here, for instance, if we had this line AB, and we wanted to express it in terms of the component of your angle at A. Okay. And this essentially derives from our, please tell me you've seen this before. Okay. And if we isolate one triangle at a time, so let's try triangle ABD. Okay, we have that, A, B, D. Let's try to first focus on your theta. Okay, so using this, if we say sine theta is your opposite over your hypotenuse. Okay, and by looking at this, your opposite of theta will be there. BD, your hypotenuse will be this portion here, AB. So if you had to express BD in terms of sine, remember when you're dealing with components, you're essentially trying to find the vertical representation as well as the horizontal. It's your perpendicular and your parallel, right? So BD would be perpendicular to our AB if we wanted to express it in terms of components, right? So the reason why we're now dealing with BD, we can even go further and give them letters. So let's say our vertical one is Y, our horizontal or our parallel one is X. So your BD would be Y, your AD would be X. And that's in terms of the components. Like, let's not forget why we're doing this, okay? So then we can just break that down further. Say our BD is Y. Then our AB would remain our AB in this instance. Okay? Then when trying to express your perpendicular component, y would be AB sine of theta. Okay, same would apply with the x. So the reason why we use sine is because y appears in the formula where we needed to include both the opposite as well as the hypotenuse. Let's say the hypotenuse is known so far. Okay, then similarly, if you needed to now get your x, okay, so x is adjacent of your angle theta, then at this point what you would say is known would be your AB. Then what includes your x, which is adjacent, and your AB, which is hypotenuse, would be your cos. So you can say cos theta is your adjacent over hypotenuse. Okay, cos of theta would be your adjacent is x, hypotenuse would be your AB. Okay, so your theta would be AB, not your theta. Why am I lying to you? Your x. AB cos theta. Okay, so this would be your perpendicular component and this would be your parallel component, right? I hope we're still together, right? But this was just this one triangle, right? Now I want us to have a look at this other triangle. I'm trying to explain this background information so we understand where we get certain things by the time we get to them, okay? So I'm just gonna draw a faint line on there. Then we're gonna isolate this triangle on this side. It looks like that. It's a 90 there. B, D, C. Then we have beta on there. That's all we have. I'll just move it on here so we can focus on it a little bit. That's all we have for now. Okay? So by looking at your angle beta, right? Opposite the beta, this essentially is your opposite side, unlike the very first triangle we dealt with, because remember that one, the angle was in a different position. So when you are presented with a question where you need to find your components and express them in terms of your x and y, just be careful of where your angle is. In this instance, our beta is right up there. Our opposite would be DC. Our adjacent would be BD. And I think the obvious one is our hypotenuse, right? So heading back to our basics. Okay, and let's say we needed to express our vertical or our perpendicular and our parallel components. I need to stop saying vertical and horizontal, right? So let's say we have, that's the, okay, that hypotenuse is in a wrong position, right? Now, looking at where your angle is and looking at your line BD. So this would be your parallel one, this would be your perpendicular one. But once you know the directions, then I don't think it really matters much how you go about calling them. You just need to know how to label them, right? Then this, since it's parallel with your adjacent side, right? I can very easily say this would be your BD cos of beta, and that, no, not BD, BC. BC, ladies and gents. She's confusing herself. Okay, so remember our component is meant to represent that slanted line over there. Okay, so this would be BC cos beta. This would be BC sine beta. And the reason why boils down to this. We can try and see if we're right. So let's say, for instance, we're trying to express this component on here, right? And what we have would be the angle on here. We have our adjacent, our opposite, our hypotenuse. And by virtue of trying to express this hypotenuse in terms of a vertical and a horizontal, it means we have to find an equation from here that involves your hypotenuse, right? And then next we need to see which one between your adjacent and your opposite will be using. Essentially, they both incorporate your angle beta. So we'll start off with our sine beta. That's your opposite over your hypotenuse, right? Sine beta, your opposite would be DC. Okay, or in this instance, we can even call it x, since that will be a horizontal component. Then your hypotenuse is that BC. It's that line we're trying to express as a component, okay? Then from here, we can already say our DC, which we can call it x, will be your BC sine of beta. Same applies, okay? So this vertical one on here, we'll call it y, we call that x, okay? So whatever's parallel to that, which will be our BD, we'll then call it y, okay? So on here we have the adjacent, then we have that BC, which is hypotenuse as well, which leads us to use the cos equation, okay? So cos of beta would be your adjacent over your hypotenuse, okay? Would be your adjacent is our BD, we can call it y, then our hypotenuse is our BC, then our BD, which is y, is your BC cos of beta. Alright, so this is why, let's just redraw it neatly while I tried. When expressing your components, this became your BC sine, oh it's beta not theta, then this became your BC cos beta. Okay, so now when we put our diagrams back together, and this is where I wanted us to essentially start off. Is there a way to have them both visible? There should be. Okay, so now when we have our diagrams together, I'll just have to make it nice and big so everything is visible. Now when we have our diagrams together, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Okay, that's your theta, alpha, beta, right? From this portion over here, we know that that's the perpendicular, that's the parallel, okay? So here we had our x, which was AB cos of theta, and here we had our y, which was your AB sine theta, okay? But on this other side, now this is where people normally get confused. It's very easy to get confused because it looks like you'll be applying the same thing. It looks like potato, potato, but it's not because the angle is not in the same position, okay? So for uniformity, I'll just put it in that direction. It doesn't change much, don't panic. So on here, our x is BC sine beta. Then on here, your y is BC cos beta. Okay, I need you to remember this very specifically because we will be getting into examples soon. And if you assume that what's happening here is exactly what's happening here, it might get confusing for you. Okay, it might in fact get confusing for you, right? So next we're moving on. Okay, unfortunately we're getting into the basics, the fundamentals, so this might be a little bit lengthy, but I want to make sure that we understand everything clearly before we get into it. Okay, so say for instance this diagram wasn't for nothing. Okay, so say for argument's sake we have maybe a mountain. We'll call it a mountain on here. Okay, has an incline in. And on this mountain or on this body or on this surface, we have a body of a specific mass in kilograms. All right. And remember, by virtue of this thing having weight, it means it exerts a force, a gravitational force, right? So it'll be that mass times the gravitational force, which will be in newtons. Okay? Right? I hope you're still with me. I hope you're still with me, right? It exerts a directly perpendicular force straight down, regardless of whether this is completely flat on the ground or if it is on an incline. Okay? But now when we have a system of this nature, you cannot calculate directly from that. Okay? You need to express what you see in terms of your components, and then you're able to incorporate your frictional resistance force, and then you can calculate, because you can't calculate what's happening if you don't know what's happening. All right? Then next up, we are essentially going to try to express this in terms of our components, right? Then we would have, okay, and if you look very closely, essentially what this represents is this second triangle on there, right? Because we're essentially getting our angle there, and we're essentially expressing components of this force mg. I want to clarify, right? So we had a ground on there, we had our body. Your force is not completely straight. It doesn't go at an angle like that. It went completely straight to the ground. But there is an angle that would be caused between that force that is being exerted on the ground and its component. Because remember, its component is a result of that force. Okay? Bear with me. Please bear with me. Alright? Then, because of this, we will then express this as our mg cos of theta, and this will be our mg sine of theta. Okay, in normal circumstances, if we were taking it as a component of this line over here, right, we would have our theta, and our components would be, let's say this was a, our components would be a cos theta and a sine theta. But we're not considering this angle here. We're considering this angle here, which is between, I'd say, your line of action or your line of force and its component. I hope this part makes sense. I really, really hope this part makes sense. Right? Then when you are considering your perpendicular components, okay, perpendicular would be perpendicular to this body and its surface. Okay, perpendicular would be this, right? Because remember, perpendicular is if you have a line, whatever is essentially acting at a 90-degree to that surface or to that line. So our perpendicular components would be your mg cos of theta, then your parallel components would be your mg sine theta. Okay, are we still together? I really hope we're still together. Then before we close it off, I want us to get into steps on how we will go about solving it, and then we'll try an example or two, and then we can close off the friction or frictional resistance module, right? So now let's go into steps. How to solve. How to solve. All right, I have about a 4-5 step process that you can follow. But if you can minimize yours into 3 by any means, please go for it. Okay, so step 1, you need to sketch your diagram. Okay, so step 1, sketch. Step 2, you need to replace your forces with components. Remember, this will include the perpendicular one and the parallel one. Okay, step 3, you need to change the total perpendicular force. This is between the body and the plane to your friction resistance or frictional resistance. Okay, so this is essentially where you incorporate your formula. Okay, you're not just getting the forces for no reason. This is where you incorporate the formula. Okay, all right, so essentially what you're doing here, you're changing from the forces that are now acting between the body and the surface to your frictional resistance, which acts parallel to the surface and against the direction of motion. It's just important to remember those things. Okay, then step 4, you are essentially solving. Okay, you equate the sum of your forces in the expected direction to the sum of the forces and components against that expected direction of motion, and you calculate the unknown. So step 4, you calculate and solve. All right. Okay, I think this is a bit of a lengthy introduction. I will cut this one here, then in the next video we'll go into examples, and we will essentially get to compare when your surface is smooth, or when it's flat, sorry, and when it is at an incline. All right, see you in the next video.